June 19th, 1944, 300 miles west of Saipan. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stands on the bridge of the fleet carrier Taiho, watching the horizon through salt-stained binoculars. His armored flagship represents Japan's most advanced carrier design, proof that the Imperial Navy hasn't surrendered technological superiority to the Americans. Around him, 9 carriers steam in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft preparing for the decisive battle Japan has been seeking since Midway. Ozawa knows the numbers. His mobile fleet carries 430 aircraft across those 9 carriers. Intelligence reports suggest the Americans have approximately the same number of carriers, maybe 15 total when you count their light carriers. The math seems almost even, perhaps even favorable, given that Japanese aircraft have longer range, allowing his pilots to strike first while staying beyond American reach. What Ozawa doesn't know, what nobody in the Imperial Japanese Navy truly comprehends yet, is that those 15 American carriers represent something fundamentally different from anything in naval history. They're not 15 individual ships built slowly over decades. They're the leading edge of a production system so vast, so impossibly fast, that by the time this battle ends, the war will already be mathematically over. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 14 of those 15 carriers are Essex-class vessels, and in American shipyards scattered across the East Coast, more are arriving every month, not one at a time, not even 2 or 3 annually. Every 14 to 20 months, another 30,000-ton fleet carrier slides down the ways, fully equipped, ready to join the Pacific Fleet. The Japanese Admiralty knows about the Essex-class program. They've read the intelligence reports. They've seen reconnaissance photos of American shipyards, but knowing and believing are different things. The numbers seem too large to be real. 24 carriers, planned, 17 already commissioned by mid-1944, all from a single class, all virtually identical, all arriving faster than Japan can train pilots to fight them. Ozawa's staff calculated that replacing Japan's carrier losses would take years. They built their entire strategy around that timeline: keep the remaining fleet intact, choose battles carefully, force the Americans into a decisive engagement where superior Japanese skill and aircraft performance could overcome numerical disadvantage. It's a reasonable plan, based on reasonable assumptions about how navies work. What they didn't account for was Newport News shipbuilding, completing a fleet carrier in 14 months, or Philadelphia Navy Yard launching 2 simultaneously. Or the fact that American shipyards weren't building ships the way navies had always built ships. They were building them the way Detroit built cars. The story of how America buried Japan under an avalanche of Essex-class carriers begins not in 1944, but in 1938, in a Washington conference room where Navy planners were finally freed from the shackles that had defined carrier design for 2 decades. For 17 years, international naval treaties had strangled American carrier development, limiting tonnage, restricting numbers, forcing designers to make agonizing compromises between capability and treaty compliance. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the London Naval Treaty of 1930 had created a world where carriers were exotic, expensive, limited assets. Each one required years of construction, massive investment, and careful protection because you simply couldn't replace them quickly. The US Navy operated 8 carriers when war started. Lose one, and you'd wait 3 to 4 years for a replacement. But in 1936, Japan formally withdrew from the treaty system. 2 years later, Italy followed. The cage door was open. American naval. Architects could finally design what they'd always wanted, a carrier built not for treaty limits, but for war. In May 1938, Congress passed the Naval Expansion Act, authorizing a dramatic increase in carrier tonnage. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, created in June 1940, received a simple mandate: design a fleet carrier that could carry more aircraft, launch them faster, take more damage, and be produced in numbers. The last requirement was crucial. Previous American carriers, the Lexington and Yorktown classes, were essentially handcrafted, each one slightly different, each requiring custom fittings and specialized construction techniques. They were magnificent ships, but you couldn't mass-produce magnificence. You could only build them one at a time, slowly, expensively. Commander Leslie Kniskern led the design team. His orders were refreshingly direct. Forget about building the perfect carrier. Build the carrier you can build quickly, repeatedly, and in sufficient numbers to overwhelm any enemy. Build something shipyards can produce without reinventing construction techniques for each hull. Build it so that replacement parts from one carrier fit another carrier perfectly. Build it like a product, not like a piece of art. The design team pulled input from everywhere. Pilots described what they needed for effective deck operations. Catapult specialists explained their requirements. Aviation service crews detailed fuel and ammunition handling improvements. Ship captains who'd commanded earlier carriers identified structural weaknesses and operational bottlenecks. Commander James Russell, who'd landed on every pre-war American carrier and just finished 2 years aboard Yorktown, brought practical experience that proved invaluable. What emerged by February 1940 was designated CV-9, the lead ship of what would become the Essex class. She displaced 27,100 tons standard, 33,000 tons fully loaded, 872 feet long, 147 feet wide at the flight deck, capable of 32.5 knots, carrying 90 aircraft at designed capacity, though that number would grow to over 100 in practice. The flight deck was rectangular, not the traditional boat shape that earlier carriers used. Aviation specialists fought for this. Naval architects warned the corners would buckle in heavy seas. The aviators didn't care. A rectangular deck meant more usable space for spotting aircraft, fewer dangerous corners during landing approaches, and the ability to launch strikes faster. Occasional buckled decks, they argued, were worth the operational advantage. They were right. Those 16 carriers would steam through a typhoon in June 1945, and 2 flight decks would buckle exactly as the architects predicted. 3 elevators moved aircraft between hangar and flight deck. Critically, one was deck edge mounted, positioned on the port side so it didn't cut through the flight deck. This meant you could spot aircraft for launch without an elevator shaft interrupting your deck arrangement. It was a small innovation with enormous operational consequences. The hangar deck sat below the flight deck, partitioned into quarters by elevator positioning. This let different squadrons maintain aircraft simultaneously without creating bottlenecks. Mechanics working on fighters in one quarter didn't interfere with ordnance crews loading bombs on dive bombers in another. Gasoline storage was generous, 240,000 gallons, enough to keep aircraft operating for days without refueling the ship. The Navy calculated that carriers needed to steam at 25 knots for 16 days, with air operations on 10 of those days, each aircraft burning 37 gallons per hour on average. Meeting that requirement meant the Essex class could operate far from supply lines, conducting sustained operations without constant logistical support. Armor protection was designed against 6-inch shells, adequate for defending against cruiser attack, but not heavy enough to stop battleship guns or heavy bombs. The decision was deliberate. Heavier armor meant slower construction, higher cost, and reduced aircraft capacity. American carrier doctrine assumed that the best defense was offensive air power. Launch aircraft faster than the enemy. Control the air. Never let enemy ships or aircraft get close enough that armor matters. Defensive armament was extensive. 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns in twin and single mounts could engage surface targets or aircraft out to 7 miles. Proximity-fused shells, brand new technology in 1944, meant these guns didn't need direct hits to destroy aircraft. Get the shell close enough, and the radio fuse detonated automatically, spraying shrapnel through the target. Closer defense came from 60 rapid-firing 20mm Oerlikon cannons and 17 quadruple 40mm Bofors mounts. Later ships would carry even more. By 1945, some Essex carriers bristled with over 90 anti-aircraft guns. Radar gave these ships awareness that earlier carriers lacked. Air search radar could detect incoming aircraft formations at 60 miles. Surface search radar tracked ships. Fire control radars directed the 5-inch guns with unprecedented accuracy. The Combat Information Center, introduced on Essex-class ships, centralized all this information, giving task force commanders a 360-degree view of everything happening around the fleet, from sea level to 30,000 feet. The first 3 contracts went to Newport News Shipbuilding on July 3, 1940, CV-9 through CV-11, Essex, Yorktown, and Intrepid. Then, after Pearl Harbor, the dam broke. Congress authorized 19 more carriers, 10 in August 1942, 3 more in June 1943, 6 more in 1944, though. These were cancelled before construction began. Contracts spread across 5 shipyards. Newport News took 7 ships. Bethlehem Steel's Fall River Shipyard took 4. New York Navy Yard took 5. Philadelphia Navy Yard took 3. Norfolk Navy Yard took 4. This diversification was strategic. One German bomb couldn't destroy America's carrier production. One labor strike couldn't halt the entire program. The construction schedule was staggering. Essex's keel was laid April 28, 1941, 14 months before the carrier was launched, 20 months before commissioning on December 31, 1942. That timeline shattered every precedent in capital ship construction. Previous American carriers took 3 to 4 years from keel to commissioning. Essex took barely 1.5. But Essex was slow compared to what came later. Franklin, CV-13, completed in 14 months. Hancock took 14 months. Shangri-La took 15 months. These weren't small boats. These were 30,000-ton fleet carriers, the most complex warships afloat, and American shipyards were pumping them out faster than Japan could build destroyers. The secret wasn't magic. It was modular construction, standardization, and mass production techniques borrowed directly from the automotive industry. Every Essex-class carrier was built from the same plans, same dimensions, same systems, same parts. A valve from Essex fit Yorktown perfectly. An electrical panel from Intrepid could be installed on Franklin without modification. Radar equipment, catapults, arresting gear, pumps, generators, everything was interchangeable. This standardization meant shipyards could order components in massive batches. Instead of custom building a steam catapult for each carrier, manufacturers built 200 catapults to identical specifications. Instead of hand-fitting electrical systems, installers worked from detailed blueprints that applied to every ship identically. Workers who learned one system on one ship could immediately work on any other ship in the class without retraining. Construction techniques evolved as the program matured. Early ships like Essex and Lexington required more hand-fitting and custom work. But by 1943, shipyards had refined their processes. They built major sections, bow, stern, midships, separately, then welded them together on the ways. They prefabricated entire bulkheads with wiring, piping, and fixtures already installed, then dropped them into place as units. The number of flat steel surfaces in the design helped enormously. Welders could work faster on flat plates than curved ones. Automated cutting machines could stamp out identical parts by the thousands. The Essex class wasn't designed for mass production initially, but certain design choices made mass production possible, and shipyards exploited every advantage. By mid-1943, the production rhythm became steady, one carrier entering service every 6 weeks on average, sometimes 2 in the same month. Essex commissioned December 31, 1942. Lexington appeared February 17, 1943. Yorktown arrived April 15. Bunker Hill showed up May 24. Every 5 or 6 weeks, another one. The Japanese watched this parade with growing horror. Their intelligence was good enough to know what was happening. They saw the reconnaissance photos. They read the American newspapers, which published detailed accounts of carrier launchings and commissioning ceremonies. They knew the names, the dates, the shipyards. What they couldn't fathom was how to stop it. After Midway, The Imperial Navy planned 15 new carriers of the Unryu class, essentially mass production versions of the earlier Soryu. Simple, unarmored, built for speed over protection. Only 3 were completed. Only one, Unryu herself, saw any service before, being torpedoed. The rest were either scrapped incomplete or never laid down at all. Japan couldn't replace carriers because Japan couldn't produce the raw materials carriers required. American submarines were strangling the supply lines that brought steel, aluminum, and fuel to Japanese shipyards. Even when materials arrived, Japan lacked the shipyard capacity for simultaneous construction. 1 or 2 carriers could be built at a time, not 6 or 7. But the material bottleneck was nothing compared to the human one. You can build a carrier in 14 months if your shipyards are sophisticated enough. You cannot train experienced carrier pilots in 14 months, not remotely. American Navy pilots spent 2 years in training before seeing combat. They flew hundreds of hours. They practiced on training carriers. They learned their aircraft inside and out. By the time they reached a fleet carrier, they were polished professionals. Japan, by contrast, was throwing pilots into combat with 3 to 6 months of training. They could fly, barely. They could land on carriers. Sometimes they could operate aircraft, after a fashion. But they weren't ready for combat against veterans flying superior aircraft with overwhelming numerical support. This training gap was the real killer. Even if Japan could somehow match America's carrier production, which it couldn't, Japan had no way to crew those carriers with competent aircrews. The experienced pilots who struck Pearl Harbor, who dominated the early months of the war, were dead. Midway killed many. The Solomons campaign killed more. The aerial battles over Rabaul, New Guinea, and the Gilberts consumed the rest. What remained by mid-1944 were replacement pilots with inadequate training being sent to die in obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds. And that's what Ozawa doesn't fully grasp as he prepares to launch his strike on June 19th. He knows intellectually that American production exceeds Japan's. He knows his pilots are less experienced. He knows Japanese aircraft, while longer ranged, lack armor and self-sealing fuel tanks that make American planes survivable. But he believes skill and tactical acumen can overcome these disadvantages. He believes in the decisive battle, the one perfect engagement that will turn the war around. He doesn't understand that the war is already over. It ended in shipyards in Virginia and Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, where Essex-class carriers slid into the water every 5 weeks. It ended in training bases across America, where thousands of pilots learned their craft properly over 2 years. It ended in logistics networks that kept those carriers supplied and repaired, no matter how far from home they operated. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, about to unfold, won't be decided by tactics or courage or aircraft performance. It will be decided by the fact that America has 15 carriers here and can replace them if lost. Japan has 9 carriers here and cannot replace them, ever. That's the war in one sentence. At 1300 hours, Ozawa launches his first strike. 69 aircraft. 45 minutes later, a second wave of 129 planes, then a third wave of 47, then a fourth of 82, 430 aircraft total, everything he has, betting everything on one massive coordinated blow that will cripple the American carrier force. American radar picks up the first wave at 150 miles. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, scrambles fighters, F-6F Hellcats, the Navy's frontline carrier fighter, climb to altitude. They're newer than the Japanese Zeros, faster, more powerful, much tougher. A Zero could outmaneuver a Hellcat, but the Hellcat pilot didn't need to dogfight. He dove from above, raked the Zero with 650 caliber machine guns, and used his superior speed to zoom away before the Zero could respond. The first Japanese wave hits American fighters 70 miles from the carriers. What follows becomes known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It's not a battle, it's a massacre. American pilots, many with 2 years of training and months of combat experience, tear through Japanese formations like wolves through sheep. The Japanese aircraft, designed for long range and maneuverability, burn when hit because they lack self-sealing fuel tanks and adequate armor. Their pilots, many with only 3 months of training, make basic mistakes and die. Of the first wave of 69 Japanese aircraft, only 20 reach the American carriers. Of those 20, most are shot down before dropping their bombs. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. A handful manage to attack, but proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells detonate before the planes can close, shredding them with shrapnel. By the end of the day, Japan loses over 400 aircraft. The United States loses 123 planes, mostly to operational accidents during nighttime recovery operations. Not a single American ship is sunk. The next day, American carriers launch a counterattack. They sink 1 Japanese carrier, damage 2 others, and destroy another 65 aircraft. By June 21st, the Battle of the Philippine Sea is over. Japan's carrier aviation arm is functionally dead. The Imperial Navy still has carriers, but almost no experienced pilots to fly from them. The few survivors from this battle will be thrown into combat with even less training than before, flying inferior aircraft against overwhelming odds. Ozawa retreats. His mobile fleet is intact on paper. He still has ships, but he no longer has a weapon. Carriers without trained pilots are just expensive targets, and Japan has no way to replace what was lost because the training infrastructure couldn't produce competent pilots fast enough even before this battle. Now, with losses mounting daily, the situation becomes hopeless. 4 months later, the Essex-class carriers return for an even larger engagement. October 24th and 25th, 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Task Force 38, Admiral William Halsey commanding, arrives with 15 carriers. 8 are Essex-class. The other 7 include 1 Yorktown-class survivor, the legendary Enterprise, and 6 Independence-class light carriers. The Japanese throw everything remaining at the American invasion of the Philippines. 4 separate naval forces converging from different directions, hoping to catch the Americans divided and destroy the landing forces. It's an ambitious plan, a desperate plan, and it requires the Americans to make mistakes. Admiral Ozawa commands the Northern Force, built around 4 carriers with almost no aircraft. His mission is simple: act as bait. Lure Halsey's carriers north, away from the landing beaches. Give the Japanese battleship forces a chance to reach the invasion fleet and slaughter the transports. The plan almost works. Halsey takes the bait, steaming north with his entire fast carrier force. But the Japanese battleships approaching from the west run into ferocious resistance from escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts, small ships fighting far above their weight class. The Battle of Samar becomes legendary, tiny destroyers charging battleships, escort carriers launching every available aircraft in suicide attacks to slow the Japanese advance. Meanwhile, Halsey's Essex carriers annihilate Ozawa's northern force. Aircraft from Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and Intrepid sink 4 Japanese carriers, a cruiser, and 2 destroyers. Commander David McCampbell, flying from Essex, shoots down 9 enemy aircraft in a single mission, becoming the Navy's top ace. The Japanese lose 26 ships at Leyte Gulf, 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, 9 destroyers, over 10,000 men. The Imperial Navy ceases to exist as an effective fighting force. After Leyte, Japanese carriers stay in port. There's no fuel to operate them, no aircraft to fly from them, no pilots to fly those aircraft. The Essex-class carriers continue their advance. By late 1944, they're launching strikes against the Japanese home islands, closer to Japan than any American carriers had ever operated. 50 miles off the coast, close enough that Japanese civilians can see them through binoculars, close enough that a single lucky bomber can cause catastrophic damage. March 19th, 1945. USS Franklin, CV-13, operates within 50 miles of the Japanese mainland, launching strikes against Honshu and Kobe Harbor. Before dawn, a single Japanese bomber penetrates the cloud cover at low altitude and drops 2 semi-armor-piercing bombs. The first bomb strikes the flight deck centerline, penetrates to the hangar deck, and detonates among 31 fully fueled, fully armed aircraft waiting to launch. The second bomb hits aft, tearing through 2 decks. Within seconds, Franklin transforms into an inferno. Fuel tanks explode, bombs cook off. Tiny Tim rockets, massive 11-foot-long air-to-surface weapons, ignite and scream across the deck like guided missiles. Ammunition cooks off in cascading explosions. The carrier goes dead in the water, 13-degree list to starboard, all radio communications lost, combat information center destroyed, fire mains severed, smoke so thick that men can't see 10 feet. Temperatures in compartments below deck exceed 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Many crew are blown overboard, others jump to escape the flames. Hundreds die in the initial explosions or are trapped below decks. Captain Leslie Geras refuses to abandon ship. 106 officers and 604 enlisted men voluntarily stay aboard. They fight fires with portable equipment because the main fire suppression system is destroyed. They form bucket brigades. They push burning aircraft overboard by hand. They flood magazines to prevent further explosions. 4 hours. They battle an inferno that threatens to consume the entire ship. The cruiser Santa Fe closes alongside, taking off hundreds of wounded while Franklin burns. The heavy cruiser Pittsburgh takes Franklin in tow. Slowly, impossibly, the fires come under control. By evening, all major fires are extinguished. Franklin is still afloat. The casualty count is staggering. 724 killed immediately. Another 807 when you count those who died later from wounds. 265 wounded who survived. It's the highest casualty count of any U.S. warship that survives World War II, second only to Arizona, which was sunk at Pearl Harbor. Franklin's crew suffers 924 total dead during the war. But Franklin doesn't sink. She limps to Pearl Harbor, then to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. She's repaired. She survives. Because Essex-class carriers were designed to take punishment and keep fighting. Compartmentalization limited fire spread. Damage control teams trained relentlessly, and the ships were simply tough, built with enough redundancy and structural strength to absorb catastrophic damage. Franklin never returns to combat. The war ends before repairs are complete, but her survival proves something Japanese admirals never understood. You can damage an Essex-class carrier. You can kill hundreds of her crew. You can leave her dead in the water and burning, but unless you sink her, she'll be back, and America has 24 more where she came from. That's the math Japan couldn't solve. Even if every Japanese attack succeeded, even if every kamikaze hit its target, even if every bomb penetrated perfectly, America was producing Essex-class carriers faster than Japan could destroy them. The war became a contest between Japanese desperation and American production, and production always wins. By war's end in August 1945, 17 Essex-class carriers had been commissioned. 14 saw combat. None were sunk. Several sustained severe damage. Franklin nearly lost. Bunker Hill hit by 2 kamikazes in 30 seconds, killing 390. Intrepid struck 4 times by kamikazes. But all survived. All were repaired. All could have returned to service if needed. 8 more Essex carriers were under construction when Japan surrendered. 6 were completed after the war. 2 were scrapped partially complete. The total construction program authorized 32 carriers. 24 were completed between 1942 and 1950. Total cost of the Essex program approached $2.5 billion. Franklin alone cost $90 million, but the investment paid dividends that extended far beyond World War II. These weren't single-purpose weapons that became obsolete the moment peace arrived. They were platforms that adapted, evolved, and served for decades. The Cold War transformed the Essex class. Jets replaced propeller aircraft. Angled flight decks were retrofitted, allowing simultaneous launch and recovery operations. Steam catapults replaced hydraulic ones. Hurricane bows were added to prevent storm damage. Radar and communication systems were continuously upgraded. Some carriers received such extensive modifications that they bore little resemblance to their original configuration. 8 carriers underwent SCB-27, A modernization, a complete reconstruction that strengthened flight decks, upgraded propulsion, enhanced aviation fuel capacity, and improved habitability. 6 received the even more extensive SCB-27C modification. 13 got angled decks under the SCB-125 program. These weren't minor refits. These were complete overhauls that essentially rebuilt the ships from the keel up. Essex carriers fought in Korea. 11 saw action there, launching thousands of combat sorties. They fought in Vietnam, Oriskany, Hancock, Ticonderoga, Bonhomme Richard, Intrepid, and others conducted repeated combat tours through the 1960s and early 70s. The last Essex carrier, Lexington, wasn't decommissioned until 1991, nearly 50 years after the class was designed. That longevity stems from the original design philosophy: build something that works, build something you can modify, build something that can adapt to technological change. The Essex class wasn't perfect. It wasn't the most beautiful carrier design, it wasn't the most advanced, but it was practical, producible, and adaptable. Those qualities mattered more than perfection. The strategic lessons from the Essex program echo through modern naval warfare. Numbers matter. You can't replace quality with quantity, but you also can't replace quantity with quality. The perfect carrier that takes 5 years to build and costs $10 billion is worthless if you only have 2 of them. The good carrier that takes 18 months and costs a reasonable amount becomes formidable when you have 24. Standardization matters. Every Essex carrier used the same parts, the same systems, the same layout. A mechanic trained on Yorktown could work on Franklin without additional training. Supply chains simplified. Maintenance streamlined. Operational flexibility increased because carriers were interchangeable. Production speed matters. Wars are won by the side that can replace losses faster than the enemy inflicts them. Japan understood this theoretically. Their entire war plan assumed they'd win quickly before American production overwhelmed them. What they didn't grasp was how fast American production could scale. 14 months from keel to commissioning for a fleet carrier seemed impossible, until it happened. Repeatedly. Training matters more than equipment. Essex carriers were formidable, but they were deadly because of the crews operating them. American pilots spent 2 years in training. They learned their aircraft completely. They practiced tactics endlessly. They entered combat as professionals, not desperate amateurs thrown into a losing battle. The Japanese perspective on the Essex class makes the tragedy clear. After Midway, Japanese naval planners knew they needed more carriers. They designed the Unryu class, cheaper and simpler versions of earlier carriers intended for mass production. 15 were planned. Only 3 were completed. Only one, Unryu, saw any active service before being torpedoed by an American submarine. Why couldn't Japan match American production? Material shortages. American submarines strangled supply lines, bringing raw materials to Japanese shipyards. Steel, aluminum, aviation fuel, all became scarce. Even when materials arrived, Japanese industry lacked the shipyard capacity for simultaneous construction. Japanese shipyards were sophisticated, but small and dispersed. More fundamentally, Japan lacked the industrial infrastructure for mass production. American automotive factories retooled for war production in months. Japan had no equivalent industrial base. Japanese manufacturing emphasized quality and craftsmanship, not speed and volume. That philosophy produced excellent individual products. It couldn't produce the quantities modern war demanded. The pilot shortage was worse. You can build a carrier in 14 months if your industrial base is strong enough. You cannot train experienced carrier pilots in 14 months, not competent ones. American training programs took 2 years because carrier aviation is extraordinarily difficult. Landing on a moving ship at sea requires hundreds of hours of practice. Combat tactics require even more training. Japan, by mid-1944, was sending pilots into combat with 3 to 6 months of training. They could fly, barely. They could land on carriers, sometimes. They could operate weapons systems, after a fashion. But they weren't ready for combat against American veterans flying superior aircraft with overwhelming numerical support. The experienced pilots who struck Pearl Harbor, who dominated the Deliant, early Pacific campaigns, were dead. Midway killed many. The Solomons campaign killed more. Rabaul and New Guinea consumed the rest. What remained were replacement pilots whose training was insufficient and whose life expectancy in combat measured in days or weeks, not months. That's the invisible part of the Essex story. The carriers were weapons platforms, but the real weapon was the integrated system, trained crews, standardized equipment, robust logistics, continuous reinforcement, systematic replacement of losses. Japan could see the carriers. Intelligence could count them, photograph them, track their movements. But Japan couldn't replicate the system that produced them. 4 Essex-class carriers survive as museums today. Yorktown in Charleston, South Carolina, Intrepid in New York City, Hornet in Alameda, California, Lexington in Corpus Christi, Texas. Walk aboard any of them and you're walking through industrial history, the physical embodiment of how democracies mobilize for total war. Stand on the flight deck of Yorktown and imagine June 19th, 1944. Imagine being a Japanese admiral watching American carriers launch 200 aircraft simultaneously, knowing those carriers can replace losses overnight, knowing more carriers arrive monthly, knowing your own air groups are dying faster than you can train replacements. That's the moment Japan realized the war was mathematically unwinnable. The Essex class didn't win World War II alone. Sherman tanks, B-29 bombers, Liberty ships, submarines, infantry divisions, all contributed. But the Essex carriers embodied American industrial philosophy in its purest form. Take a good design, simplify it, standardize it, produce it in overwhelming numbers, support it with trained personnel and robust logistics, then overwhelm your enemy with quantity backed by quality. That philosophy built the arsenal of democracy. It buried the Axis under avalanches of equipment they couldn't match, and it created a naval dominance that lasted half a century because Essex carriers kept fighting long after the war that birthed them ended. The final irony is this: Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to cripple American naval power before industrial production could mobilize. They sank battleships, damaged infrastructure, killed thousands. But they missed the carriers, and they missed something more important. They missed understanding that American industrial capacity was the real weapon, not the ships themselves. The ships were just products. Dangerous, sophisticated, deadly products, but products nonetheless. And America built products faster than any nation in history. The Essex class proved you could apply assembly line thinking to 30,000-ton warships. That once you perfected the process, you could build fleet carriers as reliably as you built cars. That quantity, properly managed, becomes quality through sheer overwhelming presence. 24 carriers, 14 saw combat in World War II, none were lost. 11 fought in Korea, 6 fought in Vietnam, 4 survive as museums. The last served until 1991. From the first keel laid in 1941 to the last decommissioning 50 years later, the Essex class defined American naval aviation. Japanese admirals never understood. They couldn't conceive of a world where carriers arrived every 5 weeks instead of every 5 years. They planned for the war they expected, the war where individual battles determined outcomes, where superior skill and careful preservation of forces could overcome numerical disadvantage. They got a different war. They got the war where mathematics determined victory, where production capacity mattered more than tactical genius, where the side that built more carriers won regardless of how brilliantly the other side fought. Vice Admiral Ozawa survived the war. He saw his fleet destroyed piecemeal, watched helplessly as American carriers multiplied while his own forces withered. In post-war interviews, he never blamed his pilots or his tactics. He blamed arithmetic. You can't win when the enemy builds 10 carriers for every one you build. You can't win when your pilots train for months while theirs train for years. You can't win when every loss you inflict gets replaced within weeks, while your own losses are permanent. That's the lesson embedded in every riveted seam of every Essex-class carrier. Modern war is industrial war. The side with greater production capacity wins, assuming reasonable competence in other areas. Technology matters, training matters, leadership matters, but production capacity matters most, because production capacity determines how many shots you get, how many mistakes you can survive, how many losses you can absorb before defeat becomes inevitable. Japan understood this intellectually. Their whole war strategy assumed they needed quick victories before American production overwhelmed them. What they didn't grasp was how fast overwhelming would arrive. They thought they had years. They had months. The first Essex-class carrier commissioned in December 1942, 1 year after Pearl Harbor. By mid-1943, 6 more had arrived. By mid-1944, 14 total, each one representing 90 aircraft, 3,000 crew, and strike capability that could devastate any target within 500 miles. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Japan started the war with 10 carriers. They lost 4 at Midway in June 1942. They replaced some losses but never caught up because American submarines sank new carriers before they reached operational status. By June 1944, Japan operated 9 carriers at Philippine Sea. After that battle, the carrier arm was effectively dead, not because ships were sunk, but because trained pilots were gone. America started the war with 8 carriers, lost 4 in 1942, but by mid-1943 had more carriers than at war's start. By mid-1944 had more carriers than Japan built in total during the entire war, and kept building, and kept training pilots, and kept replacing losses. The equation was unsolvable. That's why the Essex class matters, not because these were perfect ships, not because they were unbeatable. Franklin's casualties prove they were vulnerable, but because they represented a system Japan couldn't counter, a production system, a training system, a logistics system, an industrial philosophy that turned raw materials and labor into fleet carriers faster than any previous generation thought possible. Walk the deck of Yorktown in Charleston. Stand where Admiral Mitchell stood in June 1944, watching hundreds of American aircraft return from the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Imagine knowing that if every plane in the air were lost, replacements would arrive within days. Imagine knowing that if the carrier beneath your feet were sunk, another would replace it within months. Imagine having that certainty while your enemy fights with dwindling resources, irreplaceable losses, and the knowledge that every day brings them closer to inevitable defeat. That's the Essex class, not just ships, a system, a philosophy, a demonstration that modern war is won in shipyards and factories and training bases, not just on battlefields. The most important battles of the Pacific War happened in Newport News, Virginia, where carriers slid down the ways every few weeks, in Norfolk, Philadelphia, New York, where more carriers joined the fleet in an endless stream, in training bases across America, where thousands of pilots learned their craft properly over 2 years, not desperately over 3 months. The Japanese never had a chance, not because they lacked courage or skill or determination, because they lacked the industrial base to produce carriers at American speed. And in modern war, production speed determines who wins. The Essex class proved it. 24 carriers in 8 years, none lost in combat, decades of service, 4 surviving as museums, testaments to the industrial miracle that buried the Axis under an avalanche of steel, aircraft, and trained personnel. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.